Posting this video a little earlier than what I said on the syllabus because I'm returning all your papers and I'm returning them a little later than I normally would, but I wanted to pace us, and now I want to show you how I score these papers and just the system. So don't get in a panic. This is all geared towards you getting a good grade in the long run. Normally I give your papers back kind of when I get them, but this time I tried to give them back all at once as I would if we were in class, and show you how I give the global feedback based on good moves that students make. So here in the grading folder, if you've been here already, I've got the grading rubrics and paper examples, and now I have this good moves folder. So I'm going to walk you through the grading rubric, and here it is. I just updated it. The one I had was wrong. It was old. So I came up with this system inspired by a professor I had who said grading really got in our way of teaching, and I thoroughly agree. So I know that you got to this point in your college career, in your life, by being a good student and getting good grades. So I have rigged this entire system so that you will get a good grade. However, I still need to give feedback, and I want you to be a good writer as well. So the point system, these are FYI grades, and it's a little bit of a joke, maybe you're not laughing, but you can't get a 10. The 10 is out there. I've never given a 10. I've given a 9 plus. And the idea behind that is any piece of writing, even if it's a masterpiece, can always use a little revision. Also, these are short papers. They're drafts. I want you to have a life, right? You don't want to be working to your tail off for every single paper here, especially since you're not sure what I'm looking for, especially in the beginning. So a 9 is the best that you can get. So that's kind of like an A minus. An 8.5, that's nearly a 9. An 8.5 might have really brilliant things in it, and a 9, in fact, can be a little boring, although the writer has checked all the boxes. So there might just be something missing, grammatical errors, syntax errors, maybe just a little bit of sloppiness, kind of drafty, but again, could have great ideas in it. An 8, the writer probably has done the assignment pretty well, but it might be missing direct evidence. Some of the reading maybe is missing, lack of transitions. 7.5 is a little bit kind of like an 8.5, where it might have flashes of brilliance, but there's a lot of unevenness in it. There's missing work, maybe some interpretation of the assignment. 7 points. Usually I give a 7 if somebody misinterprets the assignment. So this might mean that this paper might be a goner, which is not the end of the world because you're going to have a chance to revise 2 of your papers for the final portfolio. So if you end up with a 7, don't freak out. It just means there was some misinterpretation. Doesn't mean you're a bad writer. 6, I never give a 6. If you're getting a 6, this means like you wrote it in the bathroom or in the car on the way to school when we went to school. So the 5, all this stuff, probably is just for if somebody really starts slacking. I'll start giving them a 5 if they hand their paper in all the time without an extension. But most of the time, this doesn't happen, right? When you get to this point, you really aren't writing a paper anymore. So I'll be frank with you about that. All right, so another thing I like to do for each paper is to show the good moves that writers have engaged in. And so I use kind of a duck, duck, goose approach to this, where I might email you and say, hey, I liked your paper. Can I use part of it as an example? So I've got some good moves, and I hope you take a look at the good moves folder, maybe look at it a little bit more closely, but I'm going to show you some examples from student papers where I thought the writer did a nice job, surprised me, used things in ways I didn't expect. And in the good moves, I'll also give you some tips. So I think the fact that your classmates engaged in these good moves should be inspiration, that we can learn from each other. Maybe not everybody was prepared. Maybe not everyone had as much time. So this is how I teach also with you, okay? So I'm going to open the good moves folder. I try to keep this fresh too. I try not to reuse good moves. And I want to say that I was very impressed overall with you, the way you handled this paper, because I've never assigned this material before. And so how you use the primary sources, it was pretty amazing because I just didn't know how it was going to work. So now I know that you can do it, and a lot of you saw the same things I did in these primary sources. So in that sense, I would say to everybody, mission accomplished. But here are these good moves. Okay, come on, man. Waiting for this to load. There we go. Okay. So you might have heard my advice in my last video about how to use direct evidence in a way where you're not just like plopping a quote in there. So I'm sure many of you heard teachers say, oh, I want direct evidence. So then a lot of times what I get is this huge ass quote like plopped in the middle of a paragraph. Like, look, I did it, teacher. No, not really. You really have to integrate that direct evidence with your own words. So a good strategy is to just bring some phrases in. So this writer brought in some phrases of Rudy's book. So later on in the paper, this writer might introduce Willis Rudy. I'd call him a historian. You know, according to historian Rudy Willis, remember using his ethos. But just using these phrases, right, that can tell us a lot about what was going on. You're using direct evidence. You show you've read the book. And then these are 2 words you don't need to come up with yourself because they're already in the text, right? So I would say in this paragraph, this writer used a good portion of the book as part of her paragraph, but it's not plopped. It's integrated with her own words, okay? So in this first case, the author summarized points from a source. So this is a good move with the source with less authority and just information, and a paragraph should not start with a direct quote. So ideas should be in your own words. Okay, so even if you're borrowing information from another source, this person put it in their own words, and maybe they were being extra careful by citing, because by this point, if you read all the information, this is probably a fair statement without citing it. So here we go. Now, some people were confused about what I meant about getting sources talking to each other. So here we have, in this paragraph, this writer relies on 3 sources. The Friess, which I said in my last video, as a source, informational. Here we have direct evidence from the primary source. Again, this writer used that move of not just using the whole quote where it gets kind of clunky, who said what, you don't want to deal with that. Just being part of the source in there and cite it. All right, this can make for some smooth writing. Sometimes, and I'll show in the next example, you want to let the reader know who authored this source. That's significant. Okay, and then even here, this author is the writer has kind of showed you where this came from, right? Okay. Okay, and then here, again, in their own words, using the source, this person is very source site driven, which is a good thing, and then interpreting the source, all right, in their own words. Okay, so a mix of direct evidence, using primary and secondary sources, your own interpretation. So that's quote unquote what I'm looking for. Okay, see my examples here. Okay, so this is another example of this writer really used the primary source carefully, which I found impressive. So going into John Price's diary, one thing I wrote in your papers is the topic is not John Price's diary. He wrote the diary, but the fact that he wrote a diary maybe isn't as exciting as what actually happened to him. What can you learn from this diary? So I think introducing the fact that he had a diary, maybe you have to do that, but the information isn't that he wrote the diary. The information is that he was there in 1918. So this writer, first of all, I would just point out this writer did a transition, right? So a transition from the earlier points and then framing the next ideas, which is something I'm kind of a stickler for, and you'll learn. So here we introduce John Price. So one thing I thought this writer did a really good job with is carefully looked at the sources. So if you recall, John Price's friend from home, he was maybe an acquaintance, died of the flu. And this is Trib, his best friend was named Trib. And Trib wrote to John and said, our buddy died. And Trib was the one who kind of let John know, hey, this flu is kind of a big deal, even though John was getting the flu. So he was probably more thoughtful in interpreting the situation than John. But anyway, this writer was careful to note who wrote that letter. And it wasn't John, it was his friend. And in a way, it doesn't matter. If you just describe who did what, you say, hey, it was John's friend, he wrote it, he said it, you're done, okay? Now, this writer did a good job trying to figure out how to do that, how to cite it, and I'm not going to be that picky about it, but probably if you were going to cite it in your works cited, you would have to say AAA, I forgot Trib's real name, I just know his nickname, just call him Bob. Bob AAA to John Price, 1918, okay? So I would just say that was careful reading. Again, after introducing the primary source, they interpret what it was all about. Okay, this is another example. Okay, and I would say again, this writer was careful to figure out who was talking and who was writing back in the day. So they do describe the source, but they also identify who said what. Okay, so when we're like presented with this glob of sources and like, how do I cite this? Relax, figure out who said it, and just say, hey, who said it? What's their ethos? Who were these people? Okay, so these were executives and administrators of the schools hosting the SATC program. So, okay, so this is another example too of the author introducing John Price. Okay, so I would say that maybe they flattered him a little bit by calling him a private. That might be a stretch considering he was barely in the Army and most of the time he was in the hospital. But here we have, during his time at the university, he kept a diary chronicling his life as a SAT student. That's a good intro, okay? And instead of saying he wrote in his diary, blah, 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 he explained what John Price did. So I just think that creates better flow. Okay. Okay, and then I think also another thing what he did here is he extracted from John Price's experience and brought it in the bigger picture, okay? So trying to figure out a way to milk that source. So here's a good move. I think Price was certainly not alone in his defiance of SATC protocols, which we know from Willis Rudy and also from those memos by the administrators of the program that this was kind of falling apart. Okay, so taking that primary source and using that source to make a broader claim based on what we know from the secondary sources. Okay, so I would say this is maybe a final example of writers getting the sources talking to each other. Okay, so the writer uses a primary source to further an idea and connects the information of the source to the broader picture while using the secondary source, Rudy, to affirm ideas and as a form of ethos. Okay, so again, in this way, the sources are talking to each other to further a point. All right, so here again, framing the idea, main idea, using a memo, a War Department memo. Okay, more from the memo. Okay, so we have the primary sources. Also using that move of just bringing in a phrase from the source. So I would say this is good analysis of a primary source. Okay, and then here we are bringing in Willis, right, as a form of ethos to interpret that data and affirm, hey, this was actually going on. And then finally, in the writer's own words, summarizing what did this all mean. All right, so you're not just plopping the stuff in there. You're synthesizing it, you're framing it, and you're analyzing it. What does it all mean? Okay, so what I'm looking for in these papers might be different than what your teachers in your trials course might be looking for or any other course, but my goal is to get you to write a paper that might be accessible to a broader audience. Maybe that you would find in a magazine, something that someone would want to read, maybe a friend, a parent. Not to say that any of the skills that you're using or learning in your other classes won't apply, but this is my, I guess, mantra as a writing teacher, that writing, anything you write should be transferable to an audience. It shouldn't just be for a class or a teacher, even though ironically it is. So you can beat me up, ask me questions about this, and I would encourage you to look at these examples. And I just would say, good job, everybody. Take some time to relax, go outside, take a break from the screen this weekend.